Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the People's School for Marxist-Leninist Studies. Today is October 22nd, 2024, and tonight our class will be on The October Revolution by J.V. Stalin. The October Revolution is a collection of articles and speeches by the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, J.V. Stalin. We have republished this work due to a distorted view in the United States of the Great October Socialist Revolution, thanks to an overemphasis of the writings of socialism's biggest traitors, Leon Trotsky. Tonight, we'll be looking over conditions for the revolution, the October Revolution and the national question, and the October and Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution. The last section will be broken into two parts for tonight. And our first section tonight is on conditions of the revolution.
Section 1, conditions for revolution. Three circumstances of an external nature determine the comparative ease with which the proletarian revolution in Russia succeeded in breaking the chains of imperialism and thus overthrowing the rule of the bourgeoisie. Firstly, the circumstance that the October Revolution began in a period of desperate struggle between the two principal imperialist groups, the Anglo-French and the Austro-German, at a time when, engaged in mortal struggle between themselves, these two groups had neither the time nor the means to devote serious attention to the struggle against the October Revolution. This circumstance was of a tremendous importance for the October Revolution, for it enabled it to take advantage of the fierce conflicts within the imperialist world to strengthen and organize its own forces. Secondly, the circumstance that the October Revolution began during the imperialist war at a time when the laboring masses, exhausted by the war and thirsting for peace, were by the very logic of facts led up to the proletarian revolution as the only way out of the war. This circumstance was of extreme importance for the October Revolution, for it put into its hands the mighty weapon of peace, made it easier for it to link the Soviet Revolution with the ending of the hated war, and thus created a mass sympathy for it both in the West among the workers and in the East among the oppressed peoples. Thirdly, the existence of a powerful working class movement in Europe and the fact that a revolutionary crisis was maturing in the West and in the East, brought on by the protracted imperialist war. This circumstance was of inestimable importance for the revolution in Russia, for it ensured the revolution faithful allies outside Russia in its struggle against world imperialism. But in addition to the circumstances of an external nature, there were also a number of favorable internal conditions which facilitated the victory of the October Revolution. Of these conditions, the following must be regarded as the chief ones. Firstly, the October Revolution enjoyed the most active support of the overwhelming majority of the working class in Russia. Secondly, it enjoyed the undoubted support of the poor peasants and of the majority of the soldiers who were thirsting for peace and land. Thirdly, it had at its head, at its guiding force, such a tried and tested party as the Bolshevik Party, strong not only by reason of its experience and discipline acquired through the years, but also by reason of its vast connections with the laboring masses. Fourthly, the October Revolution was confronted by enemies who were comparatively easy to overcome, such as the rather weak Russian bourgeoisie, a landlord class which was utterly demoralized by peasant revolts, and the compromising parties, the Mensheviks and social revolutionaries, which had become completely bankrupt during the war. Fifthly, it had at its disposal the vast expanses of the young state, in which it was able to maneuver freely, retreat when circumstances so required, enjoy a respite, gather strength, etc. Sixthly, in its struggle against counter-revolution, the October Revolution could count upon sufficient resources of food, fuel, and raw materials within the country. These peculiar conditions must not be lost sight of for a single moment. They must be borne in mind, particularly in analyzing the events of the autumn of 1923 in Germany. Above all, they should be borne in mind by Trotsky, who draws an unfounded analogy between the October Revolution and the revolution in Germany and lashes violently at the German Communist Party for its actual and alleged mistakes. It was very easy for Russia, says Lenin, in the specific historically very special situation of 1917, to start the Socialist Revolution, but it will be more difficult for Russia than the European countries to continue the revolution and carry it through to the end. I had occasion to point this out already at the beginning of 1918, and our experience of the past 2 years has entirely confirmed the correctness of this view. Such specific conditions as, 1, the possibility of linking up the Soviet Revolution with the ending, as a consequence of this revolution, of the imperialist war, which had exhausted the workers and peasants to an incredible degree. 2, the possibility of taking advantage for a certain period of time of the mortal conflict between two world powerful groups of imperialist robbers who were unable to unite against their Soviet enemy. 3, the possibility of enduring a comparatively lengthy civil war, partly owing to the enormous size of the country and to the poor means of communication. 4, the existence of such a profound bourgeois democratic revolutionary movement among the peasantry that the party of the proletariat was able to take the revolutionary demands of the peasant party, the Socialist Revolutionary Party, the majority of the numbers of which were definitely hostile to Bolshevism, and realize them at once, thanks to the conquest of political power by the proletariat. Such specific conditions do not exist in Western Europe at present, and a repetition of such or similar conditions will not come so easily. That, by the way, apart from a number of other causes, is why it will be more difficult for Western Europe to start a socialist revolution than it was for us. These words of Lenin's should not be forgotten.
And with that, we'll stop for our first discussion round.
It said that the Mensheviks were bankrupt after the war. I just want to know more about that.
So the Mensheviks were one of the parties that had formed in the interim government of Kerensky and the others that had initially favored continuing the war and were opposed to the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which would have had seen Russia lose a lot of land and ended the war. The Bolsheviks were the only ones who were in favor of the Brest-Litovsk Treaty and ending the war because, as stated, both the workers, the soldiers, and everyone in the country was just exhausted and starving from this war. Russia was in a very bad state by 1917 because not only had the Tsar been ousted, you had the bourgeoisie landowners that had been slowly hoarding resources and others while the rest of the population starved. So them, along with the social revolutionaries who were represented in the interim government, but not the Bolsheviks initially, is what they're mentioning as the utter bankruptcy before that.
Yeah, what did the reason they said for like why the Western Europe didn't have its revolution, a socialist revolution? Thanks.
Because one, as the quote of Lenin mentioned, that there were very specific conditions in Russia that started it. Continuing it would have been more difficult for Russia than the European countries, mostly due to their industrialization. And for the moment, with World War I going on and the Germans and Austrians versus the French and the English, there was that conflict going on there. So no one was paying attention to Russia. That was pretty much a dead front. And the conditions were not quite similar as they were in Russia for the launching of the revolution. Now, of course, Germany did attempt a revolution a few years later from the Russian Revolution, but that was a different outcome.
Yeah, I just want to piggyback on what you're explaining. According to Lenin's thesis on what kind of stuff will trigger a revolution is one of a few things. One is extreme repression and brutality has to be going on. Number two, a country and its people have to be not as, for many years, living very comfortably. They have to be living in near squalor where it's worse than death. Those are the kind of things that social and material circumstances that Lenin puts it is what makes revolution ripe. And that's not just coming from Lenin, that's just seen throughout history. But since we're Leninists, those of us who are here, that's what my understanding from Lenin's State and Revolution says categorically, that conditions for revolution like that are ripest when that stuff has been going on. for a long enough time. The people are suffering. They're living in near squalor. Life
60
is
seconds.
not is just worse than death, and there's a lot of brutality going on, to name a few. Thank you.
Thank you. If there are no other hands or questions, we will go on to the second section, which is the October Revolution and the national question.
All right, section 2, the October Revolution and the national question. In the period of the bourgeois revolution in Russia, which was in February of 1917, the national movement in the border regions bore the character of a bourgeois liberation movement. The nationalities of Russia, which for ages had been oppressed and exploited by the old regime, for the first time felt their strength and rushed into the fight with their oppressors. Abolish national oppression, such was the slogan of the movement. All national institutions sprang up overnight throughout the border regions of Russia. The movement was headed by the national bourgeois democratic intelligentsia. Such were the all-national institutions around which the national bourgeoisie rallied its forces. It was a question of emancipation from Tsarism, the fundamental cause of national oppression, and of the formation of national bourgeois states. The right of nations to self-determination was interpreted as the right of the national bourgeoisies in the border regions to take power into their own hands and to take advantage of the February Revolution for forming their own national states. The further development of the revolution did not and could not come within the calculations of the above-mentioned bourgeois institutions. And on the right, you have a map of ephemeral states of the Russian Civil War. The abolition of Tsarism and the accession to power of the bourgeoisie did not, however, lead to the abolition of national oppression. The old, crude forms of national oppression were replaced by a new, refined, but all the more dangerous form of oppression. Far from abandoning the policy of national oppression, the Lvov, Milyukov, Kerensky government organized a new campaign against Finland with the dispersal of the Diet in the summer of 1917 and the Ukraine with the suppression of Ukrainian cultural institutions. What is more, that government, which was imperialist by its very nature, called upon the population to continue the war in order to subjugate new lands, new colonies, and nationalities, this being World War I, of course. It is compelled to this not only because of the intrinsic nature of imperialism, but also because of the existence of the old imperialist states in the West, which were irresistibly striving to subjugate new lands and nationalities and threatening to narrow its, being Russia's, sphere of influence. And on the right is the Kerensky offensive. Thus, the old bourgeois democratic interpretation of the principle of self-determination became a fiction and lost its revolutionary significance after the bourgeois revolution. It was clear that under such circumstances, there could be no question of the abolition of national oppression and establishing the independence of the small national states. It became obvious that the emancipation of the laboring masses of the oppressed nationalities and the abolition of national oppression were inconceivable without a break with imperialism, without the laboring masses overthrowing their own national bourgeoisie and taking power themselves. That was strikingly borne out after the October Revolution. And on the right, it has a cartoon of the Russian peasant in relation to the bourgeoisie before and after the October Revolution. The February Revolution, which was the bourgeois revolution, harbored irreconcilable inner contradictions. The revolution was accomplished by the efforts of the workers and the peasants, soldiers, but as a result of the revolution, power passed not to the workers and peasants, but to the bourgeoisie. In making the revolution, the workers and peasants wanted to put an end to the war and to secure peace. But the bourgeoisie, on coming to power, strove to use the revolutionary ardor of the masses for a continuation of the war and against peace. The economic disruption of the country and the food crisis demanded the expropriation of capital and industrial establishments for the benefit of the workers, as well as the confiscation of the landlord's land for the benefit of the peasants. But the bourgeois Milyukov-Kerensky government stood guard over the interests of the landlords and the capitalists, resolutely protecting them against all encroachments on the part of the workers and peasants. It was a bourgeois revolution accomplished by the agency of the workers and peasants for the benefit of the exploiters. And on the right, I believe is a picture of Kerensky, second from the right there. Meanwhile, the country continued to groan under the burden of the imperialist war, economic disintegration, and the breakdown of the food supply. The front was falling to pieces and melting away. Factories and mills were coming to a standstill. Famine was spreading through the country. The February Revolution, with its inner contradictions, was obviously not enough for the salvation of the country. The Milyukov-Kerensky government was obviously incapable of solving the basic problems of the revolution. A new socialist revolution was required to lead the country out of the blind alley of imperialist war and economic disintegration. That revolution came as a result of the October uprising. By overthrowing the power of the landlords and the bourgeoisie and replacing it by a government of workers and peasants, the October Revolution resolved the contradictions of the February Revolution at one stroke. The abolition of the omnipotence of the landlords and kulaks and the handing over of the land for the use of laboring masses of the countryside, the expropriation of the mills and factories and their transfer to control by the workers, the break with imperialism and the ending of the predatory war, the publication of the secret treaties and the exposure of the policy of annexations, and lastly, the proclamation of self-determination for the laboring masses of the oppressed peoples and the recognition of the independence of Finland. Such were the basic measures carried into effect by the Soviet power in the early period of the Soviet Revolution. That was a genuinely socialist revolution. And on the right, it looks like you have the red flag, and they are burning the portrait of the Tsar Nicholas II. Thus was formed a socialist alliance of the workers and peasants of all Russia against the counter-revolutionary alliance of the bourgeois national governments of the border regions of Russia. The fight of the border governments, in quotes, is depicted by some as a fight for national emancipation against the soulless centralism, quote unquote, of the Soviet regime. But that is quite untrue. No regime in the world has permitted such extensive decentralization. No government in the world has ever granted to the people such complete national freedom as the Soviet power in Russia. The fight of the border so-called governments was and is a fight of bourgeois counter-revolution against socialism. The national flag is tacked onto the cause only to deceive the masses as a popular flag which conveniently conceals the counter-revolutionary designs of the national bourgeoisie. That national flag, I believe, is the same one that Russia uses today, by the way. Thus began the period of foreign intervention and occupation of the border regions, a period which once more revealed the counter-revolutionary character of the quote-unquote national and regional governments. On the right appears to be a map of the early Soviet Union and perhaps a different border so-called governments.
This map is the Russian Civil War itself. It's unfortunately in German, but you can see how the British, French, and the US invaded Murmansk and Archangel in the north. Britain came through the Baltic. The Poles actually invaded the Ukraine area. The British and the French came up through the Black Sea. Britain came up through the Caspian Sea to Baku. And the Japanese, British, and Americans came onto the east side, as you can see.
Only now did it become obvious to all that the national bourgeoisie was striving not for the liberation of its own people from national oppression, but for liberty to squeeze profits out of them for liberty to retain its privileges and capital. Only now did it become clear that the emancipation of the oppressed nationalities was inconceivable without a rupture with imperialism, without the overthrow of the bourgeoisie of the oppressed nationalities, without the transfer of power of the laboring masses of these nationalities. Thus, the old bourgeois conception of the principle of self-determination, with its slogan, "All power to the national bourgeoisie," was exposed and cast aside by the very course of the revolution. The socialist conception of the principle of self-determination, with its slogan, "All power to the laboring masses of the oppressed nationalities," entered into its own, and it became possible to apply it. Thus, the October Revolution, having put an end to the old bourgeois movement for national emancipation, inaugurated the era of a new socialist movement of the workers and peasants of the oppressed nationalities, directed against all oppression, including therefore national oppression, against the power of the bourgeoisie, their own bourgeoisie, as well as the foreign, and against imperialism in general. On the right, all power to the Soviets, peace to the world, land to the farmers, factories to the workers.
Thank you, General Secretary Joe. We will now go to our second discussion round.
Notice that it was the Soviets who gave independence to Finland and the Ukraine. They had been part of the Russian Empire. I find it ironic that they took down all the statues of Lenin in the Ukraine when it was he who gave the Ukraine independence. I find that really interesting and ironic, and I don't know if anybody knows this. But the Banderite people in the Ukraine took down the statues of Lenin, and he was the one who gave them independence from the Russian Empire. Thank you.
Thank you, Comrade Angelo. Can't have anything positive about Lenin or the Soviet Union now, can we?
Yeah, two things quick. I noticed on one of the slides at the end of the reading, where Comrade Stalin said this was the real socialist revolution. And I just want to point out something I used to hear a lot. And I know it was in a lot of the old documentaries on the revolution, where they were calling the Bolsheviks bloodthirsty tyrants, because after all, Kerensky himself was a socialist. Of course, as we all heard here, that was nothing but that was a crock, to say for lack of better words. And I just want to give a quick correction. I think the section they were talking about the nationalist flags, they were talking about in the border regions. Remember, in the border areas, you had like the Ukraine, Petyora, they were using the flag they use now in Ukraine, which is also the flag that was used by the Nazi collaborators. Same in Belarus and places like that. I think those are the flags that he was talking about.
I think it was something mentioned in the discussion section previously, where it was mentioned that, when there are destitute, deathly situations going on, that usually is, there's a rightness for revolutions similar to the October revolutions or national liberation struggles in general, but it's also possible in privileged nations as well, so long as the vanguard organizations are strong enough to, link with the masses and not with the bourgeoisie or whatever who, the bourgeois dictatorship, yeah. So it is possible as well, but much more likely in the destitute places.
Yeah, every time I hear a description of the October Revolution, I don't know why, but I picture a quiet, slow night. The town virtually, or the city virtually being empty. So my question is lighthearted but twofold. One, was it mass chaos and people running around, or was it a quiet night when the Bolsheviks got together and marched towards the state building? And two, how much of it was a gamble that it would pay off, considering how like the empire was ending and production was slowing down? Thank you.
So first off, you had the February Revolution, which was the bourgeoisie democratic revolution, where the Tsar was overthrown and the Kerensky government was put in. And the October Revolution is when the Bolsheviks decided, okay, let's march on the Winter Palace. There was some setup to this. There was a battleship called the Aurora, which fired a blank in the bay that confused a lot of the soldiers around the National Palace. And there were no shots fired as the Bolsheviks walked in and basically took over the government. At this point, though, as it had been noted, there was still the war was going on. No one wanted this war going on, and the regular people were still starving. There was mass desertion. People were desperate for the war to end, and the Bolsheviks, that was their position. They said, we're going to end the war. We're going to take Russia out, and we're not going to take part in this imperialist war anymore.
So was it like a coup, essentially, is what you're saying? That's what it sounds like, but I never thought of it that way. Never thought that.
Yeah, you could call it a coup on whatever the current government was. Basically, if one government's overthrowing another government currently in power, you could call that a coup. Now, the whether you take that as a positive or a negative connotation, that may vary, especially who's coming into power and who's losing it. But
yes, I believe in they didn't call it revolution up to a certain point. So they did call it coup. It was a coup. I mean, but they were not like bad or good connotation. It was the like objective that they took power. So to call it revolution, they must be sure that the revolutionary changes were applied for the society. So, and they proposed for a revolution. First, to stop war, give land to so the first decrees, documents that Bolshevik government signed, there was about peace, land, and factories to workers, and but they needed to just work it out, like how they do it in practically.
All right, this is interesting. A coup. We know the definition of a coup is a small group at the top overthrows another group at the top. That's our definition of a coup. When you have masses of people in the street, then it's not a coup. It's a revolution. That's the difference. So it depends on how many people were in the streets. We were under the impression, it could be wrong, that there were literally thousands in the streets. And they were average, everyday people. Some of them from the Navy and the Army. That's not a coup. That's a revolt, an uprising. So that's the difference between the terms coup and an uprising. An uprising has
60 seconds.
Has acceptance from the population. A coup, the population is not even involved because it's people at the top. That's all.
To piggyback on what Angela was just saying, here's an example that just happened in ours lifetime last year, 2020. For example, when Angelo says a coup from people that are already at the top, trying to topple people that are at the top as well. Look at the former president in our nation. That's a prime example. And you didn't have, there were a lot of people that he got to storm the Capitol, but it wasn't really as big and as many as we would have seen in the streets in St. Petersburg, which became later Leningrad. That's the difference. And a lot of those people that were there were everyday people, but they were people who were had been living very, very comfortably. And so what the former president managed to do is get them swayed that they were going to lose their
60 seconds,
their luxurious life and the privileges that they got. So what that was is what we would call a bourgeois coup is what that is what happened on January 6th in this country. What happened in St. Petersburg was a full-on revolution from people who were living, by the way, in total squalor or were living very horribly in the lead up to that. And that was like the whole rest of the majority that made up the nation of a population.
Really quickly, so when I think about a coup in a socialist perspective, I think about like Hugo Chavez and how, while he was socialist, him and like if I understand correctly, a relatively small cadre of like upper level military officers kind of took power, although they did have the support of the military. I also just wanted to mention really quick, one of the things that I learned from this and from Stalin specifically is how much the proletariat in Russia was partnering with other types of workers that weren't proletariats, and that really the dictatorship of the proletariat actually means an alliance between the proletariat and numerous non-proletarian strata of working people, so petty bourgeois, small proprietors, peasantry, intelligentsia, and all them. I just think that's interesting, you know.
We will now move on to the third section, October and Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution.
There are two specific features of the October Revolution which must be understood. First of all, if we are to comprehend the inner meaning and historical significance of the revolution, what are these features? Firstly, the fact that the dictatorship of the proletariat was born in our country as a power which came into existence on the basis of an alliance between the proletariat and the laboring masses of the peasantry, the latter being led by the proletariat. Secondly, the fact that the dictatorship of the proletariat became established in our country as a result of the victory of socialism in one country, a country in which capitalism was little developed, while capitalism was preserved in other countries where capitalism was more highly developed. This does not mean, of course, that the October Revolution has no other specific features, but it's precisely these two specific features that are important for us at the present moment, not only because they distinctly express the essence of the October Revolution, but also because they brilliantly reveal the opportunist nature of the theory of, quote, permanent revolution, unquote. Let us briefly examine these features. The question of the laboring masses of the petty bourgeoisie, both urban and rural, the question of winning these masses to the side of the proletariat is highly important for the proletarian revolution. Whom will the laboring people of town and country support in the struggle for power? The bourgeoisie or the proletariat? Whose reserve will they become? The reserve of the bourgeoisie or the reserve of the proletariat? On this depend the fate of the revolution and the stability of the dictatorship of the proletariat. The revolutions in France in 1848 and 1871 came to grief chiefly because the peasant reserve proved to be on the side of the bourgeoisie. The October Revolution was victorious because it was able to deprive the bourgeoisie of its peasant reserves, because it was able to win these reserves to the side of the proletariat, and because in this revolution, the proletariat proved to be the only guiding force for the vast masses of the laboring people of town and country. He who has not understood this will never understand either the character of the October Revolution or the nature of the dictatorship of the proletariat, or the specific characters of the internal policy of our proletarian power. The dictatorship of the proletariat is not simply a governmental top stratum skillfully selected by the careful hand of an experienced strategist and judiciously relying on the support of one section or another of the population. The dictatorship of the proletariat is the class alliance between the proletariat and the laboring masses of the peasantry for the purpose of overthrowing capital, for achieving the final victory of socialism, on the condition that the guiding force of this alliance is the proletariat. Thus, it is not a question of slightly underestimating or slightly overestimating the revolutionary potentialities of the peasant movement, as certain diplomatic advocates of permanent revolution are now fond of expressing it. It is a question of the nature of the new proletarian state which arose as a result of the October Revolution. It is a question of the dictatorship of the proletariat, says Lenin, is a particular form of class alliance between the proletariat, the advanced guard of the toilers, and the numerous non-proletarian sections of toilers. The petty bourgeoisie, the small proprietors, peasantry, intelligentsia, etc. Or their majority of these, an alliance against capital, an alliance aiming at the complete overthrow of capital, at the complete suppression of the resistance of the bourgeoisie, and all efforts at restoration on its side, an alliance aiming at the final creation and stabilization of socialism. And further on, the dictatorship of the proletariat, if we translate this Latin, scientific, historical, philosophical term into simpler language, means the following. Only a definite class, namely the urban workers and the factory industrial workers in general, is able to lead the whole masses of the toilers and exploited in the struggle for the overthrow of the yoke of capital. In the process of the overthrow itself, in the struggle to maintain and consolidate the victory, in the work of creating the new socialist system, in the whole struggle for the complete abolition of classes. Such is the theory of the dictatorship of the proletariat given by Lenin. One of the specific features of the October Revolution is the fact that this revolution represents a classic application of Lenin's theory of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Some comrades believe this theory is a purely Russian theory, applicable only to Russian conditions. That is wrong. It is absolutely wrong. Speaking of the laboring masses of the non-proletarian classes, which are led by the proletariat, Lenin has in mind not only the Russian peasants, but also the laboring elements of the border regions of the Soviet Union, which until recently were colonies of Russia. Lenin constantly reiterated that without an alliance with these masses of other nationalities, the proletariat of Russia could not achieve victory. In his articles on the national question and in his speeches at the Congresses of the Comintern, Lenin repeatedly said that the victory of the world revolution was impossible without a revolutionary alliance, a revolutionary bloc between the proletariat of the advanced countries and the oppressed peoples of the enslaved colonies. But what are the colonies, if not the oppressed laboring masses, and primarily the laboring masses of the peasantry? Who does not know that the question of emancipating the colonies is essentially a question of emancipating the laboring masses of the non-proletarian classes from the oppression and exploitation of finance capital? But from this, it follows that Lenin's theory of the dictatorship of the proletariat is not purely a Russian theory, but a theory which necessarily applies to all countries. Bolshevism is not only a Russian phenomenon. Bolshevism, says Lenin, is a model of tactics for all. Such are the characteristics of the first specific feature of the October Revolution. How do matters stand with regard to Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution in the light of the specific feature of the October Revolution? Let us rather pass on to the later works of Trotsky on this subject, to the works of the period when the proletarian dictatorship had already become established and when Trotsky had had the opportunity to test his theory of permanent revolution in the light of actual events and to correct his errors. Let us take Trotsky's preface to his book, The Year 1905, written in 1922. Here is what Trotsky says in this preface concerning permanent revolution. It was precisely during the interval between January 9th and the October strike of 1905 that the views on the character of the revolutionary development of Russia, which came to be known as the theory of permanent revolution, crystallized in the author's mind. This abstruse term represented the idea that the Russian Revolution, whose immediate objectives were bourgeois in nature, could not, however, stop when these objectives had been achieved. The revolution would not be able to solve its immediate bourgeois problems, except by placing the proletariat in power. and the latter, upon assuming power, would not be able to confine itself to the bourgeois limits of the revolution. On the contrary, precisely in order to ensure its victory, the proletarian vanguard would be forced in the very early stages of its rule to make deep inroads not only into feudal property, but into bourgeois property as well. In this, it would come into hostile collision not only with all the bourgeois groupings which supported the proletariat during the first stages of its revolutionary struggle, but also with the broad masses of the peasantry, with whose assistance it came into power. Contradictions in the position of a workers' government in a backward country with an overwhelmingly peasant population could be solved only on an international scale in the arena of the world proletarian revolution. That is what Trotsky says about his permanent revolution. One need only compare this quotation with the above quotations from Lenin's works on the dictatorship of the proletariat to perceive the great chasm that separates Lenin's theory of the dictatorship of the proletariat from Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution. Lenin speaks of the alliance between the proletariat and the laboring strata of the peasantry as the basis of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Trotsky sees a hostile collision between the proletarian vanguard and the broad masses of the peasantry. Lenin speaks of the leadership of the toiling and exploited masses by the proletariat. Trotsky sees contradictions in the position of a workers' government in a backward country with an overwhelmingly peasant population. According to Lenin, the revolution draws its strength primarily from among the workers and peasants of Russia itself. According to Trotsky, the necessary strength can be found only in the arena of the world proletarian revolution. But what if the world revolution is fated to arrive with some delay? Is there any ray of hope for our revolution? Trotsky offers no ray of hope, for the contradictions in the position of a workers' government can be solved only in the arena of the world proletarian revolution. According to this plan, there is but one prospect left for our revolution: to vegetate in its own contradictions and rot away while waiting for the world proletarian revolution. What is the dictatorship of the proletariat according to Lenin? The dictatorship of the proletariat is a power which rests on the alliance between the proletariat and the laboring masses of the peasantry, with the complete overthrow of capital, and for the final establishment and consolidation of socialism. What is the dictatorship of the proletariat according to Trotsky? The dictatorship of the proletariat is a power which comes into hostile collision with the broad masses of the peasantry and seeks the solution of its contradictions only in the arena of the world proletarian revolution. What difference is there between this theory of permanent revolution and the well-known theory of Menshevism, which repudiates the concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat? Essentially, there is no difference. There can be no doubt at all. Permanent revolution is not a mere underestimation of the revolutionary potentialities of the peasant movement. Permanent revolution is an underestimation of the peasant movement, which leads to the repudiation of Lenin's theory of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Trotsky's permanent revolution is a variety of Menshevism. This is how matters stand with regard to the first specific feature of the October Revolution. What are the characteristics of the second specific feature of the October Revolution? In the study of imperialism, especially in the period of the war, Lenin arrived at the law of the uneven, spasmodic economic and political development of the capitalist countries. According to this law, the development of enterprises, trusts, branches of industry, and individual countries proceeds not evenly, not according to an established sequence, not in such a way that one trust, one branch of industry, or one country is always in advance of the others, while other trusts or countries keep consistently one behind the other, but spasmodically, with interruptions in the development of some countries and leaps ahead in the developments of others, or ebbs and flows. Under these circumstances, the quite legitimate striving of the countries that have slowed down to hold their positions, and the equally legitimate striving of the countries that have leapt ahead to seize new positions, lead to a situation in which armed clashes among the imperialist countries become an inescapable necessity. Such was the case, for example, with Germany, which half a century ago was a backward country in comparison with France and Britain. The same must be said of Japan as compared with Russia. It is well known, however, that by the beginning of the 20th century, Germany and Japan had leapt so far ahead that Germany had succeeded in overtaking France and had begun to press Britain hard on the world market, while Japan was pressing Russia. As is well known, it was from these contradictions that the recent imperialist war arose. And with that, we'll break for our next discussion round.
I was originally planning on just talking about the Mensheviks a little bit, but that was a very interesting section. To my understanding, the Mensheviks' criticism was that the capitalist, the productive forces were not developed enough for a revolution, so that they needed to develop them more, and that the Bolsheviks were basically jumping the gun from the Mensheviks' perspective. And to an extent, they did need to implement the new economic plan after the revolution to catch up their productive forces. So they weren't completely wrong in that sense. But then, listening to all of that, it seemed like Trotsky was on the other end of things, where it was like, I was trying to set up in my mind how Trotsky was on the left and then the Menshevik perspective was on the right, with the whole tightrope thing. But then several times in that passage it says, no, permanent revolution, Trotskyism, and Menshevism are all the same thing. So now I have more questions than I originally had, because that's even more confusing for me. So I guess to put it to a question is, so then how does it get set up with the tightrope? Is it Trotskyism and Menshevism on the left? And then what's on the right? Thank you.
If I had a guess, I would say on the right would be capitulation to the ruling class. So like social democracy would probably be on the right.
Yeah, I think slides 30 and 31, the last two slides, are very, very interesting. Because you look at Trotsky and he states his beliefs, but he doesn't give any evidence that his belief is correct. That why we would, before establishing our base, say in Russia, why we would, before we do that, go out and get the world, in quotes, aligned with us. And I mean, I can see where, what Lenin and Stalin were saying is that they had to regroup and make sure that they were solid before they even considered a revolution. So if, I could see where Trotsky was blowing, hot air, but not without the plan of how he was going to go about it. And of course, action speaks louder than words. He ended up with amazingly egregious alliances to bolster his position about the permanent revolution. I just found those two slides very interesting, that's all.
To follow up what you was saying, it's interesting the way Trotsky is put on this pedestal, you could say, by the internet. It's probably not coincidence. The United States, historically, and other forces like Nazi Germany and Mussolini Italy sided with Trotskyism to fight the real communist movement. But Trotsky was a Menshevik. He joined the Bolshevik Party right after the revolution, because what the Bolsheviks did is they opened the gates for the SRs, the Socialist Revolutionaries, for Mensheviks, for anybody, even former Tsarists, to come into the party, into the new Soviet Republic, and many people did that, and some of them turned out just fine, but a lot of them didn't. And Trotsky was a Menshevik, and the Mensheviks, it goes back to 1905, because in Russia there was another revolution in 1905. And the other Mensheviks are like Julius Martov, Pavel Axelrod, and they, for example, Trotsky had disagreements with Lenin the whole time, like in 1917, even. Trotsky is much like the way we studied Angela Davis, where she used the CPUSA to build herself, and the CPUSA used her in the moment.
90 seconds.
Okay, I'll finish up. It's the same thing with Trotsky. But Lenin wrote that book, Left-Wing Communism and Infantile Disorder, to describe the left communists and the people like Trotsky, because they were against the Brest-Litovsk Treaty, which, as the comrades mentioned earlier, gave independence to Ukraine and other areas, and created the Soviet Republic. Thank you.
As I understand, first of all, we don't have to. We have to remember that Trotsky, I believe, he joined the Bolsheviks right before the revolution, because he took part of it. Like, I believe he was the person who he was clever or smart enough to see what's happening. So being Mensheviks and saying that we're not ready for revolution, let's develop modes of production and let bourgeoisie do the job. We're not ready. So this is Menshevik position. So he was on this, as I understand. But at some point he joined Bolsheviks. But his thing was other opposite things. So he said, okay, but we need to wait till all developed nations and European nations join the revolution. So permanent revolution means this, that it has to be going on and on. So it's like other side of the same
90 seconds.
Confusion. But revolution happened, but we're not content with it because it didn't happen the way it's supposed to be. So it's Menshevism from other side, kind of.
Very quickly, just to build on what the comrade just said, Trotsky was talking about needing there to be like a United States of Europe, where there was a simultaneous revolution in at least like Britain, Germany, and Russia, but that if there was a revolution in any one of those countries, that they could not succeed, because Trotsky thought that the peasants would turn on the proletarians, that the proletarians were doing a revolution just relying on other laboring people in society, but that they weren't actually establishing a dictatorship with those people, and that they would turn on the proletarians like immediately. I mean, right after the revolution happened, he was already saying that they had lost the peasants, and that they wouldn't survive long unless there was, a revolution in Germany. So just the United States of Europe. It's a very weird idea.
Time is 9:05 Eastern, so we do need to get to our last section. Our last section is a continuance of that, and comrade, that is your section. You have the floor.
All right, thank you. Section 4, October, and Trotsky's Theory on Permanent Revolution, Part 2. This law proceeds from the following. Capitalism has grown into a world system of colonial oppression and of the financial strangulation of the overwhelming majority of the population of the world by a handful of advanced countries. And this booty is shared between 2 or 3 powerful world plunderers armed to the teeth, America, Great Britain, Japan, who are drawing the whole world into their war over the division of their booty. Number 3, the growth of contractions within the world system of financial oppression and the inevitability of armed clashes lead to the world front of imperialism becoming easily vulnerable to revolution, and to a breach in this front in individual countries becoming probable. 4. This breach is most likely to occur at those points and in those countries where the chain of the imperialist front is weakest, that is to say, where imperialism is least consolidated and where it is easiest for revolution to expand. In view of this, the victory of socialism in one country, even if that country is less developed in the capitalist sense, while capitalism remains in other countries, even if those countries are more highly developed in the capitalist sense, is quite possible and probable. Such, briefly, are the foundations of Lenin's theory of the proletariat revolution. What is the second specific feature of the October Revolution? The second specific feature of the October Revolution lies in the fact that this revolution represents a model of the practical application of Lenin's theory of the proletarian revolution. He who has not understood the specific feature of the October Revolution will never understand either the international nature of this revolution or its colossal international might, or the specific features of its foreign policy. And then here's a quote. Uneven economic and political development, says Lenin, is an absolute law of capitalism. Hence, the victory of socialism is possible first in several, or even in one capitalist country taken separately. The victorious proletariat of that country, having expropriated the capitalist and organized socialist production, would stand up against the rest of the world, the capitalist world, attracting to its cause the oppressed classes of other countries, raising revolts in those countries against the capitalists, and in the event of necessity, coming out even with armed force against the exploiting classes and their states. For the free union of nations in socialism is impossible without a more or less prolonged and stubborn struggle of the socialist republics against the backward states. The opportunists of all countries assert that the proletarian revolution can begin, if it is to begin anywhere at all, according to their theory, only in industrially developed countries, and that the more highly developed these countries are industrially, the more chances there are for the victory of socialism. Moreover, according to them, the possibility of the victory of socialism in one country, and one in which capitalism is little developed at that, is excluded as something absolutely improbable. As far back as the period of the war, Lenin, taking as his basis the law of the uneven development of the imperialist states, opposed to the opportunists his theory of the proletarian revolution about the victory of socialism in one country, even if that country is one in which capitalism is less developed. It is well known that the October Revolution fully confirmed the correctness of Lenin's theory of the proletarian revolution. How do matters stand with Trotsky's permanent revolution in light of Lenin's theory of the victory of the proletarian evolution in one country? Let us take Trotsky's pamphlet, Our Revolution, 1906. Trotsky writes, without direct state support from the European proletariat, the working class of Russia will not be able to maintain itself in power and to transform its temporary rule into a lasting socialist dictatorship. This we cannot doubt for an instant. What does this quotation mean? It means that the victory of socialism in one country, in this case Russia, is impossible without direct state support from the European proletariat, i.e., before the European proletariat has conquered power. What is there in common between this theory and Lenin's thesis on the possibility of the victory of socialism in one capitalist country taken separately? Clearly, there is nothing in common. It goes without saying that for the complete victory of socialism, for a complete guarantee against the restoration of the old order, the united efforts of the proletariats of several countries are necessary. It goes without saying that without the support given to our revolution by the proletariat of Europe, the proletariat of Russia could not have held out against the general onslaught. Just as without the support given by the revolution in Russia to the revolutionary movement in the West, the latter could not have developed at the pace at which it has begun to develop since the establishment of the proletarian dictatorship in Russia. It goes without saying that we need support. But what does support of our revolution by the European workers for our revolution, their readiness to thwart the imperialist plans of intervention, is not all this support real assistance? Unquestionably it is. Without such support, without such assistance, not only from the European workers, but also from the colonial and dependent countries, the proletarian dictatorship in Russia would have been hard-pressed. After all this, what does Trotsky's assertion that a revolutionary Russia could not hold out in the face of a conservative Europe signify? It can signify only this. Firstly, that Trotsky does not appreciate the inherent strength of our revolution. Secondly, that Trotsky does not understand the inestimable importance of the moral support which is given to our revolution by the workers of the West and the peasants of the East. Thirdly, that Trotsky does not perceive the internal infirmity which is consuming imperialism today. Carried away by his criticism of Lenin's theory of the proletarian revolution, Trotsky unwittingly dealt himself a smashing blow in his pamphlet Peace Program, which appeared in 1917 and was republished in 1924. But perhaps this pamphlet too has become out of date and has ceased for some reason or other to correspond to Trotsky's present views. Let us take his later works, written after the victory of the proletarian revolution in one country, in Russia. Let us take, for example, Trotsky's postscript, written in 1922 for the new edition of his pamphlet Peace Program. Here is what he says in his postscript. The assertion reiterated several times in the peace program that a proletarian revolution cannot culminate victoriously within national bounds may perhaps seem to some readers to have been refuted by the nearly 5 years' experience of our Soviet Republic. But such a conclusion would be unwarranted. The fact that the worker state has held out against the whole world in one country, and a backward country at that, testifies to the colossal might of the proletariat, which in other, more advanced, more civilized countries will be truly capable of performing miracles. But while we have held our ground as a state politically and militarily, we have not arrived, or even begun to arrive, at the creation of a socialist society. As long as the bourgeoisie remains in power in the other European countries, we shall be compelled, in our struggle against economic isolation, to strive for agreement with the capitalist world. At the same time, it may be said with certainty that these agreements may at best help us to mitigate some of our economic ills. To take one or another step forward, but real progress of a socialist economy in Russia will become possible only after the victory of the proletariat in the major European countries. Thus speaks Trotsky, plainly sinning against reality, stubbornly trying to save his permanent revolution from final shipwreck. It appears then that, twist and turn as you like, we not only have not arrived, but we have not even begun to arrive at the creation of a socialist society. It appears that some people have been hoping for agreements with the capitalist world, but it also appears that nothing will come of these agreements, for, twist and turn as you like, real progress of a socialist economy will not be possible until the proletariat has been victorious in the major European countries. Well then, since there is still no victory in the West, the only choice that remains for the revolution in Russia is either to rot away or to degenerate into a bourgeois state. It is no accident that Trotsky has been talking for 2 years now about the degeneration of our party. It is no accident that last year Trotsky prophesied the doom of our country. How can this strange theory be reconciled with Lenin's theory of the victory of socialism in one country? How can this strange prospect be reconciled with Lenin's view that the new economic policy will enable us to build the foundations of social economy? How can this permanent hopelessness be reconciled, for instance, with the following words of Lenin? Socialism is no longer a matter of the distant future or an abstract picture or an icon. We still retain our old bad opinion of icons. We have dragged socialism into everyday life, and here we must find our way. This is the task of our day, the task of our epoch. Permit me to conclude by expressing the conviction that, difficult as this task may be, new as it may be compared with our previous task, and no matter how many difficulties it may entail, we shall all, not in one day, but in the course of several years, all of us together fulfill it, whatever happens, so that NEP Russia will become Socialist Russia. How can this permanent gloominess of Trotsky's be reconciled, for instance, with the following words of Lenin? As a matter of fact, state power over all large-scale means of production, state power in the hands of the proletariat, the alliance of this proletariat with the many millions of small and very small peasants, the assured leadership of the peasantry by the proletariat, etc., is not this all that is necessary for building a complete socialist society from the cooperatives? From the cooperatives alone, which we formerly looked down upon as huckstering, and which from a certain aspect we have the right to look down upon as such now under NEP? Is this not all that is necessary for building a complete socialist society? This is not yet the building of socialist society, but it is all that is necessary and sufficient for this building. It is plain that these two views are incompatible and cannot in any way be reconciled. Trotsky's permanent revolution is the repudiation of Lenin's theory of the proletarian revolution, and conversely, Lenin's theory of the proletarian revolution is the repudiation of the theory of permanent revolution. Lack of faith in the strength and capacities of our revolution, lack of faith in the strength and capacity of the Russian proletariat, that is what lies at the root of the theory of permanent revolution. Hitherto, only one aspect of the theory of permanent revolution has usually been noted: lack of faith in the revolutionary potentialities of the peasant movement. Now, in fairness, this must be supplemented by another aspect: lack of faith in the strength and capacity of the proletariat in Russia. What difference is there between Trotsky's theory and the ordinary Menshevik theory that the victory of socialism in one country, and in a backward country at that, is impossible without the preliminary victory of the proletarian revolution in the principal countries of Western Europe? Essentially, there's no difference. There can be no doubt at all. Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution is a variety of Menshevism.
Okay, thank you. We will now go to our wrap-up announcements. New Outlook Publishers is our sister publishing house, and for an update on that, I will turn the floor over to Comrade.
Please visit our partner publishing house, New Outlook Publishers. Of course, you can find the topic of tonight's class, the October Revolution, by Joseph Stalin. Our latest release was Trotskyism in the Service of Franco. But also keep an eye out. We'll have a couple of releases coming out within the next week as we catch up. So once again, purchasing books from New Outlook Publishers helps support the school, and you can find them at newoutlookpublishers.store.
Yeah, so the first Wednesday and the first Saturday of the month, we have the Harry Bridges School of Labor. And the next class is going to be on the series on the history of the CIO. We're going to be talking about the Steelworkers Organizing Committee, the history of its founding, and a little bit of what happened after its founding. And yeah, so the correction that's put in was the first Wednesday and following Saturday, following the first Wednesday of the month.
And we will close out now with our closing song of the internet.
We want a condescending savior to rule us from a judgment hall. We were possessed not for their fame,